Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Ag Innovation News Podcast, presented by the Agricultural Utilization Research Institute of Minnesota. I'm Dan Scogan, your host for the Ag Innovation News Podcast. Now, guests on this podcast shed light on innovations in value-added agriculture, highlight important voices and work that's being done throughout the Minnesota ag sector, and educate the public about resources and organizations that support Minnesota agriculture. Today, we welcome to the Ag Innovation News Podcast Juan Medina Bielski, Malting Scientist with RahrBSG, and Alexandra Ostlund, Business Development Director of Novelty Supply Chains for AURI. Juan, welcome to the podcast, and let's start with you. Tell me a little bit about yourself and your pathway or the pathway that brought you to Rahr.
The first thing that brought me towards this direction was beer. I really enjoyed drinking it at first, and then I've always been kind of a tinkerer and do-it-yourselfer, so I got into homebrewing beer when I was in college and even planted barley and wheat, dug up the front yard of the house and planted some row crops, and then also planted hops, and I thought I would do it from scratch all the way from the beginning, and then eventually thought I would get into maybe starting a brewery. I graduated with a chemistry degree from the University of Minnesota and eventually found my way to the quality lab here at Rahr. I kind of morphed into the position that I have now through basically taking advantage of opportunities, getting elevated into more research position or more research related tasks. So then they kind of carved out the position for me of malting scientist as we commissioned the pilot malting system and instituted our micro malting program. So I kind of helped pioneer these research malting programs here at the Rahr Technical Center.
I maybe should have started with this, but for those who don't know and were listening to our podcast today, who is Rahr and what do they do?
RahrBSG is, I guess, the family. It was initially Rahr Malting, founded in 1847, was a Rahr beer actually, but Rahr Malting since the 20th century. And it's the biggest malting company in North America. Largest, I guess, the single largest malting facility in North America as well, second largest in the world. So malt being the main ingredient of beer is quite the endeavor here. We're close enough to the grain growing regions of the country that it's very economical to produce a large amount of malt here. And then BSG was the distribution group. So initially it was a separate entity, and Rahr acquired a group of companies that were selling beer ingredients. So BSG now was the supplier for especially craft brewers. And then recently there's been a restructuring. So the company is now RahrBSG. So Rahr is still the brand of malt, and then there's the brewer supply group that kind of does the sales. But that's kind of the network of the Rahr world here.
So besides your appreciation for beer, was there anything in particular that intrigued you about going to work for Rahr?
I guess the scale, the innovation, it's really quite the industrial masterpiece here. If you ever get a chance to see it, anyone who's in Minnesota, it's a very impressive facility, and the capabilities that we have here at the Rahr Technical Center are very advanced for the industry. It's really a world-class laboratory, and for me, it was a great place to work. Obviously, I was looking for a good paycheck, but when I was setting out, I was looking to kind of just improve my apprehension of brewing and beer science so that I could eventually start my own brewery. Well, I kind of left that ambition behind, but in the meantime, continued to grow my aptitude for brewing and malting science and continue to take courses and further my professional development. But it's really a great place to work. I'd say the culture is very strong. The connections to the brewing world are very gregarious and warm, and the company culture is very tight-knit, and I think overall it's a great place to work. I don't know if there's one single thing that brought me over, but there's just a panoply of nice things about being at Rahr.
Alexandra, how about you? Tell our podcast listeners a little bit about yourself, your career, and your work at AURI.
Well, before I do, I just have to say I've known Juan for a couple of years now through our work together, and I didn't know all of those little tidbits, so that was really interesting, Juan, to hear your path. I appreciate that.
Sometimes our guests learn something too.
Yeah, you wouldn't think so. After all of our conversations, I didn't realize that you tore up your front yard to grow row crops. That's kind of interesting. My pathway is maybe a little bit less straightforward. I grew up on a farm in Southwest Minnesota, and so I think agriculture has always been in my blood. But for most of my early career, I looked pretty far away from Minnesota to pursue interests related to international development, things like climate change mitigation projects with community groups in different countries, assessing, for example, supply chains in forestry products or urban agriculture or food security with nomadic tribes. I mean, my work sort of spread out into all these different threads based on which opportunities seemed interesting at the time. But a lot of them were working on long-term community and economic development opportunities in developing countries. And it took me a long time to kind of draw myself back to the US and more specifically to Minnesota. But I think the through thread for me has always been agriculture, regional climate resilience, and community based work. And so now at AURI, I work in a different field and in a different capacity, but I think those elements are still very much present in my work here in the state of Minnesota.
So, as Business Development Director of Novel Supply Chains at AURI, typically what might you be working on?
Well, it's really changed over the years. I've been with AURI now for more than 3 years, and some of my earlier work was really focused on emerging crops, things that are coming out of the University of Minnesota's Forever Green initiative, like winter annuals such as winter camelina and pennycress, perennial crops like perennial flax, and what we're here to talk about today, which is Kernza, some nuts and berries and other things. And I continue to work on some of those emerging crops, but I've also spent some time digging into initiatives that sort of aim at understanding the market potential for developing different things, like, for example, decentralized green ammonia or hydrogen production hubs in the upper Midwest. We know that nutritional inputs are really important for production ag, but they can carry a large carbon footprint and often travel a long distance before we're deploying those tools. So what's the opportunity for producing them in the areas that we're actually using them? And how does that impact cost to farmers or environmentalism and things like that? And I'm about to launch into a new project for sustainable protein innovation as part of the MBOLD group of work. So there's always something new to work on, which I think is a big appeal to me in working at AURI. There's always a new challenge to face, and that interests me greatly.
Today, I'd like to take us into a little bit of a deeper dive into distilling Kernza. So let's start with the obvious question. What is Kernza and why are we distilling it? Juan, maybe you can fill in some of the gaps.
Kernza, the perennial crop, I guess Alexandra talked about kind of the development of these crops that are kind of looking like an important part of our agricultural future. Kernza has the benefit of being perennial. Maybe we would call it a semi-perennial because it has a kind of a peak and decline in its production, but it's an intermediate wheatgrass that is a lot like wheat, not exactly like wheat. So from a brewing perspective, distilling perspective, it performs in ways that brewers and distillers might kind of be familiar with, but slightly different. And I guess why we would want to use it depends on your perspective. If you want to support an innovation of this sustainable grain, I think that's a major motivation for a lot of the people that have decided to use Kernza. The Patagonia Provides program has been really key in getting brewers to utilize Kernza in a raw form. And then similarly from distillers, some of them are eager to use these sustainable products. I think through some of the work that we've done through our technical center, AURI, we've proven out that Kernza also has the benefit of providing some really unique features that you don't get from other grains. So most recently, I think the biggest discovery was the incredible flavor potential that is in the Kernza, especially when malted at a higher color. Feel free to add anything there, Alexandra, maybe that I missed.
That's a great launch pad. Yes, it is a perennial grain. And I would say, to Juan's point, the ecosystem services that it provides, for example, it has a really long root system. It's great for the soil, it's great for the water, it's great for habitat. And the perennialization of agriculture to, reduce labor and reduce inputs and still keep up with production of foods or other co-products is a big draw with Kernza. But to Juan's point, it also does have a really unique flavor profile. And so our role at AURI has been digging into different product areas and utilization applications to understand how does that unique attribute or that unique flavor lend it to one way or another as far as making it into something else. And I think that paired with the premium price of Kernza, being that it is still an emerging crop, we're still in the breeding program with Kernza. So there's this kind of constant feedback loop from commercialization efforts back to the breeding program. And there's this feedback of what do we need to continue to improve it, for example, on yields or grain size that make it easier for processors to work with. that is all still in the mix. So it makes it a little bit expensive. And working in the brewing and distilling areas, it seems to kind of be well suited, not just for the flavor, but also that there's maybe a little bit more margin to play with, so to speak, in that space versus other areas like baking, where it can be a little bit cost prohibitive.
Well, you both mentioned flavor, so I'm going to circle back to that one first of all. Juan, what's the flavor profile? What are we tasting when we taste Kernza beer?
I'll distinguish that the malted Kernza particularly has this flavor that I'm talking about. And we did multiple iterations of malting and discovered that by adding more heat in the kilning part, we develop more flavor. And these flavor notes include cinnamon and sweet notes, other sweet spices, allspice, maybe nutmeg, ginger. But then we got also some like almond or marzipan, amaretto, dark fruit like black cherry. We had a lot of variety in this bouquet of aromas and flavors that we got. And imparted to beer, I actually got to try one just the other day at Bad Weather Brewing. They actually have one on tap right now, Sweater Weather. And those notes do come through in the beer, even at a small inclusion.
So was it hard to distill, or is it very similar to other grains?
Well, that is a great question. So for brewing beer, it does present a major challenge in that the grain is very small. So this is also a challenge for malting, where it's really been an obstacle to other people wanting to malt with it. I had to do some modifications to my equipment and techniques to malt it well, and mostly due to the small grain size and its shape. But this also translates to the brewers having an issue because they use these roller mills that require a certain gap. The purpose of the brewer roller mill is to crack the grain. So for typical barley malt, they just want to crack the grain. It has a husk, and that husk is useful in the brewing process when they're lautering or filtering the wort. Kernza doesn't have a husk necessarily, so it does have a husk. We dehulled it for our purposes because it tends to lose its husk easily. And in my estimation, it was better to have a uniform product without a husk than one that was losing its husk during the process. So this is still maybe a matter of debate of how to best handle it. There are disadvantages to dehulling the Kernza, which include damaging the kernel. But without the husk, the brewers face an additional challenge because they have less of that filtration material that the husk offers. And then since it's so small, they can't crack it with their mills. So some of the alternatives are to mill it very finely. So Modest Brewing in Minneapolis did do a beer with Kernza. I believe they have a mash filter, which allows them to very finely mill with a hammer mill rather than a gapped roller mill. And they can handle these very fine particles, unlike typical mash and lauter tun brewers. So the big challenge for sure is the kernel size. And then another one is the Kernza has very high protein. So this can be an advantage or a disadvantage. And in our initial work, we did note that if you want protein, you can leverage it to your benefit. So some brewers like to produce hazy beers, or I should say there are certain styles that are advantageous with the high protein. So if there's a hazy IPA or a Saison, something like that you want to include the Kernza, it's going to benefit you. It can work against you in beers that are better produced with low protein ingredients. So a typical light lager or Pilsner is going to have basically a challenge working with Kernza. So for distillers making whiskey, some of those issues are not as big of a challenge. Typically, they're going to be able to use enzymes more liberally. They're going to maybe distill on the grain, so they're not worried about separating the wort from the grain. They're not going to face as many issues as the brewers are, and they're not concerned about the protein being conveyed into the spirit. Another maybe universal challenge for alcohol producers is that the extract, which is basically our industry term for the amount of starch that's available, is lower in Kernza compared to other grains. So less starch means that you have less alcohol available to be produced in your process.
Sounds like stay tuned as we go kind of refine the process and continue to work with it. Alexandra?
I was just going to add, there's two other challenges. I think you hit most of them, Juan, and maybe even some that I wasn't aware of. But two other ones, if we're talking, like, I think, Juan, what you were mainly describing was working with Kernza as a raw grain, right? But then if you want to go further and add that value of malting it, there are two additional challenges there. One is that you're starting with an already premium priced grain. And if you add that value of this malting step before brewing or distilling, then you're going to be adding a little bit of cost into your value chain as well. And the second being, when Juan's talking about some of the technical challenges because of the size, the malt equipment that you need to use can also be limited. Like I had a malt house that was interested and could work with it at the right capacity, as far as the scale that we're at right now, but they didn't possess the correct equipment that would enable them to work with it. And I believe, Juan, you've told us in the past that a floor malt is kind of the piece that a malt house would need to work with it correctly, right?
Yeah, so I touched on that a little bit, that I had some challenges with malting it, but yeah, the big issue is the grain size. And so with typical pneumatic malting, which is probably 99% of maltsters, you have a false bottom, which is going to be a perforated floor. And the purpose of that is to have airflow through the grain, and that helps control the conditions for cooling and humidity. And floor malting is basically done without that perforated false bottom. And the difference is, with pneumatic malting, the grain bed is going to be, 3 to 4 feet deep. And with floor malting, it's going to be like 6 to 8 inches deep. And the floor malting relies on turning the grain periodically, but basically the grain bed isn't too deep that the grain can't respire and exchange air, because in that process, the grain is alive and respiring, so it needs oxygen and needs to dissipate CO2. So a floor maltster can have just a smooth concrete floor, and then they can turn the grain basically with rakes and shovels. And then as it grows rootlets, it kind of coalesces or holds together a bit. And then you would move it to a kiln, which also has a perforated floor, but at that point with the rootlets is less likely to fall through. So the big challenge for maltsters is the grain is so small, it falls through their perforations that are more typically engineered for grains of the size of barley or wheat.
Thank you for elaborating on that.
I want to remind our listeners that you're listening to the Ag Innovation News Podcast, and our guests today are Juan Medina Bielski. He's the Malting Scientist with RahrBSG, and Alexandra Ostlund. She's a Business Development Director of Novel Supply Chains at AURI. Alexandra, Kernza, is there a readily available seed stock, and are farmers embracing it?
That is a great and somewhat complicated question. I think as Kernza has progressed through the breeding program and some early adoption with farmers who are kind of willing to work with it as it continues to change, there has been interest that has grown and waned over the years, depending on how the market is responding and the various support mechanisms like organizations like AURI and the Land Institute in Kansas or the University of Minnesota or other grant programs that are sort of supporting the production and processing and market development of this grain. So it continues to change. I think there are times where it feels very promising and like we're getting all the kinks figured out, and then other times where the challenges seem a little bit more prominent. And I would say a lot of that has to do with working with any new grain. You're going to have this unique challenge of trying to grow supply and demand at a similar pace, so that one doesn't outdo the other and kind of tip the scales and kind of unbalance that system. So yes, farmers are embracing it, and there continue to be challenges. I think as new lines come out, for example, I believe next year in 2025, there's going to be a new line that's available for production agriculture. So they're currently growing the supply of that seed right now so that farmers can begin working with it. I believe Minnesota Clearwater was the first kind of commercially available line, and that's the one that most farmers have been working with. So the introduction of this new line, I think, will start to address some of the challenges that Juan was just mentioning as far as the size and shape of the grain, but also move us toward larger yield sizes. And there will be successive lines coming out over the next, decade and a half as the breeding program continues. But it can be really challenging for farmers, in a nutshell, to understand it's not a resilient supply chain yet. And so they are pioneers in this space as we continue to develop this market.
And farmers typically turn their head when they can see the economic benefits. Is the market strong for Kernza as a grain?
Yeah, I think for any interest from a farmer or anyone in the world who's doing anything, the cost has to make sense, right? You're not going to do something if you're losing money on it. That has also changed over the years. I think about a year and a half ago, there's a cooperative in Minnesota here that changed the price of their Kernza to about half of what they were offering it for in an attempt to spur some demand or get some market contracts in place. I'm not sure if they feel that was successful or not because, I've talked to various farmers and some of them were on board with that strategy and others felt like it would maybe lead to at least a short-term decline in their, return on that labor and cost that they've input. But it will continue to be a place where we're just trying to find the right puzzle pieces to fit together. So I would say at this point, there is a lot more interest than maybe there are solid contracts that farmers feel empower them to continue working with the grain. But hopefully programs like the Patagonia Provisions Beer Program, which is national, they've doubled the amount of brewers that are working with it. Hopefully things like that will improve things. There are other CPG companies that I hear about kind of in the ether of my networks that are apparently interested and about to sign the proverbial dotted line. Those would also enable a lot more supply and therefore, resilience for contracts and farmers. But there's just a lot of things that remain to be seen, I think.
Juan, I'm going to come back to you on the process again. AURI, of course, all about value-added products and processes. Is there a value in the co-product that's generated through this distilling process?
Yeah, I mean, that's going to be in line with any waste stream. So it's going to be the same value as wasted barley malt or wheat malt or raw grains that are used in distilling or brewing. These are typically of feed value. So oftentimes brewers or distillers will just give these for free to farmers as basically an agreement that the farmer helps them get rid of waste material at no cost and the farmer gets free feed. At certain large scale, some breweries and distilleries are able to monetize it and make money on it, but it's really on a case by case basis as to the arrangements brewer or distiller can make with farmers because it's a lot of work to deal with and there is the cost of picking it up with a truck, but there isn't probably a large value added market for those wasted grains. I guess one thing I'd like to add, if I can just circle back real quick about the challenges, I kind of omitted the aspect of flaked grain. Alexandra and I worked a little bit together on this, but I think this is actually maybe the easiest foot in the door, so to speak, for Kernza into the brewing and distilling world. I think this is where it's already getting the most traction, and Sustainagrain has led the way, I think, on producing a marketable flaked Kernza. I don't think it carries quite the same flavor potential, but it does allow brewers to use it easily and quickly without really having to think too much about changing their process.
So, Alexandra, if people listening today have had their interest piqued a little bit, where can they go to learn more about the work that you and Juan have been doing or AURI and Juan have been doing? Is there a Kernza report that they can look up and get more details?
Yes, we have put out a number of reports over the years that include or have embedded within them the reports that Juan at RahrBSG has done for us and others at RahrBSG, including brewing, distilling, malting, all of that work is all kind of included in our reports. The most recent one is called Kernza for Brewing and Distilling, Value Added Research Report. It will be available in January 2025 online. And you can find that at AURI.org, and you can just search for Kernza in malting, brewing, and distilling. If they're interested to try some Kernza beer, Juan already mentioned that Bad Weather Brewing in St. Paul has a new brew called Sweater Weather. It's a winter warmer that has toasted coconut, cinnamon, and vanilla bean. And then 9 Mile in Bloomington is also working with the kilned Kernza malt that Juan was working with. And they should also have a couple of kind of winter or Christmas themed beers on tap.
Great. Juan, anything else that you're working on that you can share with us yet, or any bright shining stars out there on the horizon?
I do a lot of wide variety of work. Recently, I worked at the University of Arkansas trying to malt some rice. I was kind of, I'd say, mixed results there at best, but oftentimes I'm working on innovation projects for improving our processes. So I guess I can maybe talk a little bit about it, but overall, it's kind of geared towards sustainability, improving our water usage, trying to find ways of optimizing our usage of water, minimizing our wasting of water. I also do support breeding programs. So I've worked a lot with the University of Minnesota. They do breed winter barleys and other new malting varieties. So the micromalting that I do here is a very high throughput. So we can do around 88 samples per week. And that allows us to get quick malting feedback to the breeders. So typically breeders are looking at agronomic aspects, but for malting barley, it's also important to know how it's going to perform for malting and brewing. So without the micromalting data, it's kind of tough to navigate that field. So I support breeding programs in Canada and the US, and then also the American Malting Barley Association that sanctions the new varieties. So we participate in some of those breeding support programs as well. As far as more details on other things I'm working, I don't think I can expound a lot on that because I think there are, trade secrets to the nature of a lot of the work that I do, but I hope that's a good enough answer for now.
There's a lot of stuff potentially in the hopper anyway. We're not going to see a brew pub open by you anytime soon. Have you given up on that dream, or?
Yeah, I think I've left that one behind. It's a very competitive space and a high risk, I think, to open a brewery. And I think people are doing a really great job. And I don't mind drinking the beer others are making. I still like to homebrew, and that's fun from time to time. But if anything, I more aspire to get into the agricultural side of things, back where I started in my front row crops at the house.
Alexandra, how about AURI? Planning any additional projects or Kernza work in the near future?
I guess in my estimation, sort of worked our way out of what is needed at the moment. And I'm sure we will keep Kernza on our radar for things coming down the line. There will definitely be more work to do, but we're sort of waiting to see what our role in this next iteration of support will look like. So for now, we are waiting in the wings and watching the market.
So Juan, as we close things up here, final thoughts from you. What do you want to leave us with today?
I guess I would like to just reiterate that the unique flavor profile of the Kernza is really something that we need to follow up on in the brewing community. I really do hope some craft maltster is able to pick up on the malting. And again, I'd like to reiterate that for brewers that are out there interested, flaked Kernza is available now on the market. It does also have great flavor. And then for people who are just a common layperson, maybe they like beer or they like spirits, try to communicate to your brewer or your distiller at your local producer that you're interested in buying products with Kernza, and they'll be more likely to pick up on it.
Alexandra, final thoughts from AURI's perspective. What do you want to leave us with today?
I think Juan nailed it. It was well said. I guess I'll just leave it with, gratitude for our continued collaboration and work with RahrBSG Technical Center, and Juan specifically has been lovely to work with over the years. And just grateful for all the pioneers along the value chain for Kernza, including producers and processors and other support organizations that are working to perennialize our agricultural food system. I think these grains are important for the climate resilience they provide, but what we've been talking about today is also this really unique flavor that we're adding into our foods and our beverages. Those are not things that happen easily or quickly, but I think it makes it more interesting for all of us.
Well said, and thanks for joining me today. We've been visiting with Juan Medina Bielski, Malting Scientist with RahrBSG, and joining him today was Alexandra Ostlund, the Business Development Director of Novelty Supply Chains for AURI. I want to thank everyone for joining the podcast today and for listening to the Ag Innovation News podcast presented by the Agricultural Utilization Research Institute of Minnesota. Thanks to my podcast crew, Lisa Martinez, AURI Communications Manager and the editor of this production. To learn more about AURI, just go to auri.org.